If you only listened to the headlines yesterday, you might think this war is winding down, the hardest part is over, and some kind of deal is already taking shape. That is the picture the president tried to paint. He suggested Iran had essentially accepted the terms Washington wanted, that the Strait of Hormuz was no longer an issue, and that even the nuclear question was moving toward resolution. The problem is, almost none of that holds up once you compare those statements to what is actually happening. The strait is not truly open in the way that was implied. Iran has not agreed to surrender its nuclear material. And while all of that optimism was being sold to the public, the United States quietly moved late at night to extend permissions tied to Russian oil, effectively easing pressure on the country that has been one of Iran's most important partners and a state that has been linked to support for attacks that killed American service members in this conflict. So, before we talk about progress, we need to ask a more basic question. What exactly is going on here? At the most fundamental level, this war is still active. There is no clean signal that a real peace process is taking shape. There is no solid proof that the major disputes have been settled. And yet, the public messaging coming out of Washington keeps sounding like the finish line is right around the corner. Yesterday, President Trump declared that the Hormuz issue was finished. He also claimed Iran had agreed it would never again use the strait as leverage. But that narrative barely survived half a day before it started falling apart. Iran's military spokesman responded by saying the waterway had returned to strict military control because of repeated American violations and what they described as piracy disguised as blockade enforcement. That statement came fast, and it directly contradicted the idea that shipping had simply returned to normal. In other words, when the president said the strait was open, Iran's immediate answer was essentially, no, not like that. Their position was clear. If the blockade remains in place, then full freedom of passage does not exist. From their perspective, the blockade itself is an act of war, and until that changes, there is no honest basis for pretending the crisis is over. Even the more carefully worded diplomatic language coming from Iran did not say what many people in the West seemed eager to hear. When Iranian officials talked about passage resuming, they were not describing some unrestricted international reopening. They were talking about a system still controlled and supervised by Iran, with routing and movement taking place under Iranian oversight. That is a very different reality from the one being sold in brief political sound bites. So even in the first hours after the president's declaration, the claim did not line up with the facts on the ground. It was misleading at the moment it was spoken, and it remains misleading now. Then the Speaker of Iran's parliament stepped in and made things even more explicit. He argued that the president had thrown out 7 separate claims in the span of an hour and that every one of them was false. He said lies would not help win the war and would not produce results at the negotiating table either. He also made clear that if the blockade continues, the Strait of Hormuz will not stay open in any meaningful sense. Movement through that passage, he said, will happen only along routes approved by Iran and under Iranian authority. The message was unmistakable. Control over the strait will be decided by events in the real world, not by declarations on television or social media. And that brings us to the bigger problem. We are now at a point where official government messaging cannot be taken at face value. That is a bad place for any country to be, especially in wartime. But it is the reality we are dealing with. In fact, uncomfortable as it may be to say, Iranian statements on some of these issues have been more internally consistent over time than what has come out of Washington. That does not mean Iran is trustworthy in some broad moral sense. It means that if you compare claims to outcomes over the past stretch of this conflict, the American side has repeatedly said things that do not match the visible reality. And yes, there is always a familiar defense for this kind of behavior. People say leaders sometimes have to mislead in order to confuse adversaries. But there is a line between strategic ambiguity and repeatedly telling your own public things that do not appear to be true. A government should not need to deceive its own citizens in order to manage a foreign conflict. If that is truly the only available method, then it is evidence of failed leadership, not clever statecraft. There are better ways to handle uncertainty than flooding the information space with claims that collapse on contact with reality. What makes it worse is how casually some of these statements are delivered. No one forced this issue in the moment. There was no urgent need for the president to go out and declare that Hormuz was open if that was not an accurate description of the situation. So, why do it? Why introduce a dramatic claim that immediately affects public perception, global markets, and diplomatic expectations if the facts do not support it? One possibility is simple political performance. Another, darker possibility is that these statements matter less as military analysis and more as market signals. Now, I want to be careful here, because the inner workings of high-level trading are not really my specialty. But what keeps standing out is the timing. Every time there is a major statement about this war, there seems to be unusual trading activity just beforehand. Yesterday, there were reports of around $760 million being made in the narrow window before the claim spread that the Strait of Hormuz had effectively reopened. Oil prices dropped hard, markets reacted instantly, and someone, somewhere, made an astonishing amount of money. That kind of wealth does not appear from thin air. When markets swing violently, the gains for a small number of people are often built on losses dispersed across retirement funds, institutional investors, and ordinary participants who never even realized they were on the other side of the trade. So while the public gets a glossy story about progress and stability, a tiny circle may be cashing in on the chaos. And if that is even partially true, it should infuriate people. Because while fortunes are being made in air-conditioned offices, American service members are still deployed in danger, still enforcing policy in an active combat environment, still waking up each day not knowing what the next missile, drone, or command might bring. That contrast is hard to ignore. On one side, there are people in uniform sitting inside a live war zone. On the other, there are polished announcements that seem to have more effect on commodity charts than on military conditions. If these declarations are not changing the facts on the ground, then what are they really for? Because from where this sits, their most immediate effect is not peace. It is movement in the market. And while all that is happening, we are also being told that Iran is somehow ready to hand over its nuclear material with no financial exchange involved. The president has repeated versions of that claim more than once over the last 2 days, as if Tehran is on the verge of simply giving up one of its most sensitive assets. But Iranian media, citing the foreign ministry, pushed back hard on that idea. Their message was that enriched uranium is considered as sacred as Iranian territory and will not be transferred under any circumstances. That is not a minor disagreement. That is a complete contradiction. And more importantly, it is consistent with what Iran has been saying. So, again, even if you wish the American version were true, wishing does not make it so. The public keeps hearing claims that sound like breakthroughs, but the other side keeps saying nothing of the sort has been agreed to. At some point, responsible analysis means recognizing that optimism is being manufactured faster than results are being produced. Iranian reporting also said there is no agreement yet on the next round of negotiations, and that this is tied directly to the maritime blockade and what Tehran views as excessive American demands. Their position, at least publicly, is that they do not intend to waste time in drawn-out talks that lead nowhere. Now, yes, that could be bargaining posture. It could be part of the dance that always surrounds serious negotiations. Countries posture, officials bluff. That is normal. But here is the point that matters. As of April 18th, there is still no scheduled next round of talks. That fact alone tells you how much caution is needed. Because when one side keeps implying a deal is near, while the other side says discussions are not even formally back on the calendar, the gap between rhetoric and reality is enormous. The ceasefire is supposed to expire in just a few days. Maybe it will be extended, maybe not. But right now, the hard evidence does not show a conflict rushing toward resolution. It shows a conflict sitting on unstable ground, with the most important issues still unresolved. Reuters reinforced that picture by reporting that major differences remain between Washington and Tehran in efforts to end the war. One senior Iranian official said there is still no agreement on the detailed nuclear issues and that serious negotiations are still needed to bridge the divide. He added that Tehran hopes some kind of preliminary framework could emerge in the coming days, and that a ceasefire extension might create room for additional talks focused on sanctions relief and compensation for war damages. In exchange, Iran would offer reassurances about the peaceful nature of its nuclear program. And then came the line that may be the most revealing of all. Any narrative suggesting something more advanced than that is a distortion of the real situation. Honestly, that may be the simplest summary of the whole moment. Distortion. That is what so much of this feels like. Not clarity, not strategy. Distortion. Instead of letting facts develop and speaking carefully, American leadership seems determined to rush ahead of reality and declare outcomes before they exist. Personally, I would rather hear less and infer more. I would rather have silence from leadership than a flood of statements that read like spin, fantasy, or manipulation. And this is not just about one man freelancing at a microphone. The broader administration keeps reinforcing the same pattern. Look at Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Just 2 days ago, he was asked directly whether the government planned to renew waivers involving Russian oil, which would allow more money to keep flowing into the Russian economy. Remember, Russia is not some neutral side player here. Moscow has been accused, with evidence presented, of helping Iran target and kill American personnel during this war. This is not a country the United States should be casually helping enrich while claiming to pressure Iran. Bessent's answer at the time was straightforward. He said those waivers would not be renewed. No general license for Russian oil. No general license for Iranian oil. Clear language. Firm posture. The kind of statement designed to remove ambiguity. But then, almost immediately, reality shifted again. Reports from DW said that late Friday night, when governments often release politically toxic news in the hope that fewer people notice it, a new license was issued allowing countries to buy Russian oil loaded onto vessels through May 16th. And that timing matters. Everyone in politics understands what a late Friday release means. It is the graveyard slot. You put something out when the work week is over, newsrooms are thinning out, and by the time people catch up, the story is already slipping out of the public cycle. Governments do that when they know a decision will trigger criticism. They do it when they want maximum legal effect and minimum public attention. What changed here is also important. Previously, the waiver covered oil that had already been loaded before the blockade, and the wider escalation took full effect. That was one thing. This new move appears broader. It says that as of now, oil loaded by now can still move under the waiver window. That is not just administrative cleanup. That is a policy choice. And lawmakers were quick to call it out, arguing that the decision helps prop up the economies of both Russia and Iran during active conflicts, weakens efforts to cut off Russian war revenue, and complicates America's standing with allies. So again, what exactly is the strategy? That question keeps coming back because the pieces do not fit together. Did the administration reverse course in less than 48 hours? If so, why? What new fact changed the calculus so dramatically? Or did officials simply tell the public one thing while planning another behind the scenes? Neither answer inspires confidence. Either the policy is chaotic or the messaging is dishonest. Maybe it is some combination of both. But what it does not look like is a disciplined, coherent plan. And that is what makes this moment so unsettling. It is not just that war is dangerous. War is always dangerous. It is that the people expected to explain policy are instead making the picture murkier. They are saying peace may be close while battlefield conditions remain volatile. They are implying nuclear concessions that do not exist. They are talking tough on oil waivers and then quietly extending them. Each individual contradiction is troubling. Taken together, they paint a picture of an administration that either does not control its own narrative or is using that narrative for purposes that have very little to do with honest public communication. Maybe there is a larger plan no one can see yet. Maybe there are secret channels, private assurances, and strategic calculations that will make this all look more coherent later. That is possible. But if that is the case, then the visible layer of communication is doing a terrible job of preparing the public to understand it. And if there is no deeper plan, then what we are watching is even worse. A high-stakes foreign conflict being narrated through exaggeration, contradiction, and market-moving theater. That should bother every American, regardless of party. Because once trust in wartime communication breaks down, everything gets harder. Markets become more unstable. Allies become less certain. Adversaries become harder to read. And citizens begin to assume that every headline is just another performance designed to shape emotions instead of convey facts. That kind of environment is toxic, especially when lives are on the line. At the end of the day, the biggest issue here is not one misleading statement or one quiet waiver extension. It is the pattern. The pattern is what matters. A claim is made. It creates a wave of optimism or confusion. The facts come in later and show the situation is far less settled than advertised. Then another claim arrives, and the cycle begins again. Over time, that erodes public trust and leaves people trying to build a picture of reality from scraps, contradictions, and foreign press reports. And that is not how this should work. The American public should not need to decode its own government like a hostile intelligence service. People should not have to compare domestic statements against foreign spokesmen just to figure out which version of events is closer to the truth. In a functioning system, wartime communication should be serious, disciplined, and rooted in reality. Right now, it feels more like smoke, mirrors, and selective timing. So that is where things stand. The war is still active. The Strait of Hormuz is still contested. The nuclear question is not resolved. Negotiations are not formally back on track. The ceasefire deadline is approaching. Russian oil waivers have been extended after officials suggested they would not be. And through all of it, the public is being told a story that looks cleaner, calmer, and more complete than the facts seem to justify. Maybe the coming days will prove that real progress is happening behind the curtain. Maybe talks will resume, the ceasefire will hold, and some kind of framework will emerge. But as of right now, the gap between what is being said and what can actually be verified is too wide to ignore. And when that gap keeps widening in the middle of a war, the danger is not only on the battlefield, it is in the loss of trust, the distortion of public understanding, and the possibility that the people paying the highest price are the ones getting the least truth.